They say, hate the sin, but love the sinner. There is sin in our society, in our church. There is rampant, uncontrolled wrongdoing and lawlessness in our country, in our church, and even in our family. So, why do we need to talk about this? Because even the church has lost the battle against sin. Jesus talks about this very needed subject on the discipline of the sinner. And there are three things that I'd like to just focus on this important subject that Jesus taught. So Jesus taught that the purpose of discipline is to rehabilitate the sinner. Jesus also taught that due process is required before judgment. And then lastly, judgment must fall on the sin. Rehabilitation. The subject about the judgment of sinner came up because of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were observing that Jesus associated with the sinners. And so they had a suspicion and doubt, if Jesus is close to the sinner, he must be a sinner himself. If he is too gracious to the wrongdoer, there must be something that he is also guilty about. That's why he cannot confront the sin. And so in response to that, Jesus told the story about the 100 sheep, where one of the sheep got lost. And Jesus talked about the shepherd who left the 99 to rescue the one lost sheep. And so therefore, he continued to talk about the judgment or the discipline of the sinner. The first thing that we observe about the teaching of Jesus about discipline, if your brother sin against you, go and tell him his fault just between the two of you. That is something very important, because Jesus is saying that the purpose of confrontation, of correction, is to win your brother. Go and tell him just between the two of you. Jesus is for discipline. He is not ignoring sin. He is not excusing sin. Go, tell between the two of you. That is saying that the first approach to wrongdoing or lawlessness is an amicable and a peaceful settlement. Not involving anybody, no outsider. Because after all, the problem, the solution, is not with others, but with the person. Ultimately, that is where the problem can be solved, between the two who are involved in the sin. So that is the first approach, is so that may not be too easy, because the offended party may not have the attitude in his heart to approach the wrongdoer, especially the wrong is done against him. And so this first approach requires that there is a forgiving spirit. But if forgiveness is impossible, understandably, at least it is suggested by reason or civility to talk the matter over. Even when there is no forgiving spirit, that can be possible. So the reason for this is because it is not judgment of the sinner, but giving the sinner a chance to think it over, to pray over this, to find peace with God, peace with his enemy, and be rehabilitated. That is the principle for this approaching the sinner in private, in peace. So before you go to court, you go to the barangay. Before getting an attorney, you try all means that are possible in the name of peace. However, that may not be possible because, as the saying goes, happy endings are not often the cases for many. The fact is, very little percentage of problems work with happy endings. And so when that happens, the second step Jesus taught is, go ahead, confront sin. Jesus is for confrontation. Jesus is not just all grace, because the problem with many is all grace or all law. But Jesus has this balance between law and grace. And so when the grace period has failed, so go ahead. It is inevitable that the trial must proceed. And so he called for witnesses. That is a term that is usually applied in court proceedings. A witness is one who is credible, is one who is reputable, is one who can tell the truth, because that is the important thing. Because the accuser needs to approach this not just by his own solution now, no more private, but he is turning over the matter into the hands of the court or the council. And so, He cannot take the law into his own hands, no revenge, no unlawful response, such as fighting in order to correct the mistake. It is now, in the second step, the hands of the witnesses to handle the matter. So, the accused is brought to trial with the witnesses of the accuser, but also the court allows that there is also an attorney for the accused. So, even in church, there should be an attorney, a defender for the accused to defend his rights. And this next step of bringing in witnesses makes it more difficult for the accuser to abuse the rights even of the accused. Accuser to abuse the rights of the accused. So what this is saying is that there must be due process in the judgment. And that means that the accused is innocent until proven guilty. There is no extrajudicial procedure, no extrajudicial killing, but there must be only judicial process. Due process must be followed. No immediate judgmentalism. There's been a survey that has been conducted why people leave the church, and especially the young people. And one of the reasons that came up is because of the judgmentalism of the churches. So it's very important that there is the proper procedure or rule to follow in this. So what is the sin that needs to be corrected, that needs to be tried, that needs to be judged? Usually, cases in church involve sexual offenses. These are often the reasons for discipline, for judgment. What does Jesus think? Often, sexual cases are treated as if it's the biggest of all sin. And the other sin in a smaller amount. What does Jesus think? For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. Those are sins that Jesus enumerated. It is wider in the list. There has been some cases of published offenses by churches, and for example, the Iglesia ni Cristo several years ago was in the news because of corruption in the higher ups involving the leadership itself. And so, it was in the media. The mother of the head was complaining against his son for corruption involving finances. And so, and abuse of power. One of the things that was given as the reason for the media not to get involved is the separation of the church and state. Here is a case of a misrepresentation of the doctrine of the church and the state, because the church is not above the law, but the church is also subject to the law of the land. The separation of the church and the state doesn't mean that the church can do whatever it wants, even if it is wrong. However, the case did not prosper. And so this approach of putting the sinner in trial is also still opening the door for rehabilitation. There is law, but there is also rehabilitation, because it says that if the brother listens to you, then you have won your brother. If he does not listen, therefore there is a chance that the brother might listen. If he did not listen to the one accuser, he might listen to the witnesses. So the purpose of the witnesses is not just to rule or to preside in the case, but also to provide rehabilitation. To turn the accused from sinner to listener. Isn't that rehabilitation? No judgment in this case yet. That will be in the last stage. There are examples in the Bible of discipline. There is the example of David, who sinned big time, committing adultery with Bathsheba and plotting premeditated murder, the death of Bathsheba's husband Uriah. Big time. And so Nathan, the prophet, confronted David about this sin. There was still rehabilitation. David wrote Psalm 53, and this was especially during the time when he was contemplating his sin. There was a time of withdrawal and focusing on prayer and meditation on the Word of God, particularly Psalm 53. So, discipline involves a period to give the sinner a time to spend time with God. The witnesses leading Bible study and prayer with the criminal. Often the complaint of people who were disciplined is that after the discipline, nobody took care of them. Other cases in the Bible of discipline, there are many, but I'll just point out a few. David. And another example is Ananias and Sapphira, who lied about money and instantly died. Another case is Achan, who stole loot from the winnings of war. And this is horrific. Joshua ordered that Achan, including his wife and children, family, were stoned to death. That bothers me. Why not just Achan? True, Israel lost the battle with Ai, and so many soldiers were killed. And that is probably the reason for such severe discipline or judgment. This teaches us that there are some cases when rehabilitation, Achan, Ananias and Sapphira, are no longer possible. But death, the ultimate punishment. There is also a very important incident about Jesus himself practicing discipline. There was a case when a woman who committed adultery in the act was caught in the act, and so was brought to Jesus. And so this is a very difficult case because the law requires that that sin must be punished with stoning to death. And so this is a very difficult case for Jesus. Jesus upheld the law because Jesus is not against the law at all. No, Jesus implemented the law. Jesus even whipped, took a whip, driving away the money changers who desecrated the temple. And so Jesus is not all grace. Jesus is law. And so Jesus, during this awesome moment, upheld the law. And yes, he agreed. The adulteress, as the law requires, must be stoned to death. But there is an interpretation of the law that was very different and very radical. And that is, Jesus added, "He who has no sin among you, cast the first stone." And so what Jesus is saying in effect is that this law, the death penalty, is abolished. Who has no sin to cast the first stone? It has been suggested by tradition that this woman was Mary Magdalene. Jesus did not condone the sin of the adulteress. He said, "Go and sin no more." So he saved the sinner. There are times when everything has failed, and so the third step to take is judgment, justice. It must be allowed to take its proper course, having followed all the judicial and just process. So Jesus' advice taught, tell it to the church and treat the sinner as an outsider, because all else that have been tried to rehabilitate and to save did not work. Justice is the only recourse now. Tell it to the church. It is very important to observe here that this teaching of Jesus is applied to the unrepentant. To the unrepentant. Because all else was rejected by the sinner. No repentance, no acceptance, no pleading guilty, no admission. And so, what Jesus was saying, to take this last step is for those who have not repented. There is a case that was dealt with in one church where two young people were disciplined. She got pregnant, and so they were made to confess to the church. The young people wanted to get married. They repented. But even though they repented, they were not married, not allowed to be married in the church. That was wrong. So what is the right case in the life of Christ? Because in Jesus' life, there was nothing that we can see as an example of Jesus. Condemning the sinner. What is the closest to the unrepentant that Jesus condemned? Interestingly, it is not the prostitutes, it is not the tax collectors, but it is the Pharisees. The strictest and the strongest woe that Jesus taught was to the Pharisees. They were the ones that Jesus condemned and judged for their unbelief and their constant rejection of the truth. And he pronounced the most stinging judgment against such Pharisees. Every ninth day of the month, XBC, through 4 members of XBC, pray for the inmates of Precinto 9, ninth day for Precinto 9. I think it's very important because we can easily forget that we are all sinners. And so that is one of the reasons why I continue to have attention and interest among the HIV/AIDS people, and the inmates and the sinners, so that I will be reminded I am a sinner. I can very easily fall into the trap of Pharisaism, hypocrite. It is very interesting that during my studies in ATS, public confession is something I did not hear. Paul mentioned something very specific in 2 Timothy about the elder being rebuked in public. Yes, that is public announcement, different from public confession. Go ahead, announce. But to make the sinner go further in humiliating after the punishment, the double whammy of the humiliation in public is unjust. There is no justice. Go ahead and announce. Actually, I learned this teaching from IVCF, where I was judged for homosexual fall.